So you have to write a paper. Maybe not now, obviously. I know for many of you, you're watching this as part of orientation. It's early days in your university career. The last thing on your mind right now is writing papers. It's the beginning of school, but I can promise you it will come. You would go to a liberal arts university, which means that there is a lot of focus on paper writing. So one of the things we wanted to do as part of orientation is just familiarize yourself with the kind of expectations that your professors might have for your papers, for your classes, what you can be doing to help start getting ready. That's where I come in. My name is Brent, and I am the learning specialist here at Tyndale University, and that's a fancy way of saying that I oversee the writing and tutoring program we have here. Now, I hope many of you will come and join us for appointments throughout the course of the semester where we can talk about your papers in more depth, but for now, let's just get some of the basics out of the way, shall we? So join me, and let's see what we can find when we learn about how to write some papers. So first things first, let's talk a little bit about what we're going to actually be talking about today, some of the details we're going to be going over. We have a few different things. First, we're going to talk about hamburgers. That may sound weird to some of you, but for those of you coming out of high school, that might sound a little familiar, but we'll get into that in a moment. After that, we're going to talk a little bit about preparing your paper. What are the steps you should be doing before you start writing to make sure that your papers do well? Then we're going to talk a little bit about structuring your paper. What does a good paper structure look like, and what should be included in most of those cases? And then in part 2 of this is actually going to be a 2-part video. In the second part, we're going to be looking a little bit more closely at citation, one of the most important aspects of academic writing. So stick with me, but let's begin by talking about hamburgers. Now, there is this idea called the Hamburger Essay, sometimes taught in high school. That says every essay should have 5 paragraphs, 3 points, and 1 topic. So it's a 5-paragraph essay. 3 of those paragraphs are about one of the points, and then you have an introduction and conclusion, and then the entire essay should be about 1 topic. So that's kind of the gist of the Hamburger Essay. You may have also been taught in the past, or have heard, that every paper needs a thesis statement, and that it will always be at the end of your introduction. You may have also heard that papers are about regurgitation, not opinionation, if that's a word. It's your job to regurgitate, not just share your opinion on things. You don't want to be, it's not about you and what you think, it's just about referring to what other people think. And you may have heard that it's MLA all the way. That is the only citation style you should be using, and that's how you cite things correctly. And I'm here to tell you today that all of this is a big fat nope. Not that there's not value to some of these things. There's definitely some elements about this that are important. So it is true that a lot of times your papers will focus around one big topic. In fact, that's what you should be doing, one topic that you're going to focus on. But as you go about your university career, you're going to hit 12-page papers towards the end. And if you have to write a 3-point 5-paragraph essay that's 12 pages long, that's something like 2 pages per paragraph, and that's far too long. So that's one thing you want to be watching out for right off the top. As you get in, some of your points are going to have more details. You're going to need multiple paragraphs to get at some of those points. And don't feel you're limited to 3 either. You can have 2 points for an essay. A comparative essay might only have 2 things you're comparing, so 2 points. You can have 4. You can have 5 points. It really depends now. So don't feel you're limited to that one structure. Most of your papers, actually that's not true, all of your papers will still have a thesis statement, but they won't necessarily come at the end of your introduction. That is common in the humanities, things like English or history, some of your biblical studies courses, but they will not be the case for things like philosophy or APA papers like psychology or sociology. But we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. It is true that your job is not often to only share your opinion, but you're not just regurgitating either. You're not here to just summarize the research, but actually to use research to explain a point that you want to prove. So your opinion is now more valued in the university setting, especially if you're doing things like reflection papers, where a large majority of your writing will be focused around your thoughts. And yes, every single paper you write will need to be cited properly, but not all of them use MLA. In fact, that's one of the least cited citation styles at this point. But again, we'll talk about what to use when in different circumstances in our second part. So let's talk, if this is what you should not be doing, this hamburger style essay, and we need to be open, let's talk a little bit about what you should be doing. What do you actually have to do for different paper types? First, let's talk about research papers. Research papers are the standard. They are kind of the beginning type of paper for most disciplines. And the key thing here is that they aren't just summarizing the research. People have this idea that it's just about summarizing what other people have said, but that's not really the case. Your goal here is to actually take information from other sources, to use that information to back up an argument of your own. So you're going to look at books and journal articles. You're going to look at chapters from books, or from look at different essays, and you're going to be using that information to back up something you want to say. Not necessarily your opinion, but a thing about a book, about a novel, something about a time period or a theological stance that you want to prove. That's your goal when incorporating research into your research paper. Now, as I said, that's the standard, but there's a lot of other paper types as well. A big one, especially in your later years on the university side and also in the seminary side, is an exegetical paper. Now, exegetical papers are basically a close and specific study of scripture. There are often steps you're going to want to do before you begin. So things like, what is the historical context of the book you're looking at, the literary context, what's its genre, its authorship, when was it written? All of those kind of things are what you're going to want to look at first. And then from there, you're going to have to do a careful analysis of a short passage of scripture, often 7 to 10 verses-ish, that is going to, where you're going to look into the context, the themes, and the meanings of that passage. So you're going to do an in-depth study, an in-depth analysis of that book and the passage, and then say something about what it means, what it's about, what it's trying to communicate, both to its original context and to us today. Another very common paper type, especially on the seminary side, is a reflection paper. So a reflection paper is a lot more opinionated than some of the papers we've talked about thus far. It will also be a lot more personalized. Now, this doesn't mean you don't have a thesis statement. Yes, you may not be trying to prove an argument per se, but you are still trying to present an idea that you think is important. Often reflection papers will focus on, what did you learn in a class? What did you learn on a spiritual retreat? What did you learn from a book? In each case, you're going to want to focus on the big takeaway, the thing that you learned from reading or that God showed you through that experience. That's what you want to emphasize in your thesis. And again, your goal is still a clear, coherent, and coordinated paper. It should still have a structure. It should still have paragraphs that flow logically from one to the next. But that's something you're going to want to focus on in your reflection papers. It's a little bit more about you and what you think and your experiences, less about proving a point. There's also going to be a lot of types of papers that deal with books and articles and summarizing and criticizing them. So the one common type is a book summary paper. And in here, your goal is not persuasion, but analysis. Your goal is, in this case, a lot more regurgitation. You want to emphasize the thesis that the original author had. What was that author trying to prove or trying to communicate? And then your goal is to break down the main points, the big ideas that author was trying to communicate. You may have a small portion devoted towards the end for criticism. Your professor might ask you for give me a page or so just saying whether you agreed or disagreed with the argument, something like that, but only if the professor asks for it. Now, on the flip side, we also have book or article reviews. And here is actually almost the opposite. Your emphasis here is a careful analysis of the argument and the argumentation. So now your goal is full criticism. You want to be looking at the argument and say, was it argued well? Was it argued effectively? Did they communicate their point in a way that got you to believe it? Or did you find holes? Were there problems with the argumentation? Would you have wanted more evidence for certain sections? That's the kind of thing you'll be analyzing in a book review. And again, you may have a small portion of summary at your professor's request, usually towards the beginning. Now, the key thing I have to stress here is that there is no one standard all the time. Different professors have different expectations, and it may be that some of what I've said today doesn't entirely match up exactly with what your professor is looking at for their assignment. So always defer to your professor's judgment, or defer to what your professor has instructed either in class or in an assignment sheet, but this is the generic things that you can use to start figuring out how you want to work on your papers. But again, always check with your professor first if you're unsure. Now, okay, so if that's what different types of papers are, how do we go about preparing for them? How do we go about actually beginning a paper? And there's a lot of different ways. I like to have some different brainstorming techniques, and you can experiment with any of these. So consider free writing. This is where you literally sit down and either take a pen and on a piece of paper, or maybe on Microsoft Word, you just start writing. You don't worry about coherence. You don't worry about logic. You don't even worry about whether your ideas are good or not, or even censoring yourself. At this point, you just write. You get the ideas on a page. And then afterwards, you go back, you take those brainstormed ideas you have, and you start organizing. What makes sense with what? Are there patterns that you're beginning to see? But the idea here is just get your ideas on the page. Allow yourself to just think, and then maybe come back to it later and organize those ideas better. Maybe that's not you, though. Maybe you are a little bit more of a list person. Then you might try asking yourself journalist questions. These are the who, what, where, when, why, and how. All of these questions are valuable, but especially why and how. Why did this author write this novel? Why did the characters in that novel behave a certain way? Why was this battle launched in the first place? Why did the early church adopt a certain stance theologically? How can also be useful. How does this thing compare to that thing? How did this empire rise or fall? Those are the kind of questions you're going to be asking yourself a lot. Who's and what's and where's and when's as well are useful, but ask yourself these kind of questions. And oftentimes with those questions is going to become your research question, the place you want to begin looking in more depth to help you understand what you want to research for the rest of your paper. If that's not your style, consider clustering or word mapping. This can be especially useful if you're more of a visual learner. The picture behind this slide is actually kind of what we're aiming for here. You put your key idea in the middle of the page, and then you branch off with different ideas that come off of it. Whether it's like sub-ideas, whether it's arguments for or against, that's what you're going to put there, and then you can branch off of all those ones with little additional ideas, draw arrows connecting different things. If you're a visual learner, that might be a better way for you to process your information. If you're more of an auditory person, if you like to speak your ideas out loud, try discussing the topic you have to research with a friend or a family member, a roommate. Just talk with them. Maybe they'll have some ideas that you can follow up on as well, and you can go back and forth. And maybe even get them to scribe your ideas. If you're not a big writer, get them to scribe what you've been saying so that you can then, again, go back later, read over your notes or the notes they've made, and then look for connections between ideas. The goal here, though, is to get your ideas flowing. So whatever works for you, there's no one foolproof method of brainstorming. Find the idea that works for you and run with it so that you can begin getting your papers ready in an effective manner. So once you have that initial topic, that initial idea, that initial question you want answering, it's time for research. Now, I am not here today to talk about research in depth. I know the library will be sitting down in one of these sessions as well to talk you through some of this, but just a couple of key ideas. You have your WorldCat catalog search here. That's where you're going to put in some keywords related to your topic or your research question. It's a great place to start your research, especially if you're doing so primarily online. You'll be able to find journal articles and ebooks and print books as well, where you can get information on what you want. But if you need a more specific search, something that goes into details about this term but not this term, or I need to know this exact wording, advanced search is a good place to start. You can compare terms and rule out certain sources and all of that kind of stuff. That's a great way to do advanced search. And if you're looking for journal articles but you don't want to just give it into the open and ask for anything, there's this database at the bottom called periodical databases. It has every database Tyndale has access to, and from here you'll be able to do research for specific subjects or specific topics. So for example, if you're doing biblical studies on the university side or doing a number of theology and Bible courses on the seminary side, the ATLA religion database is a great place to start. It has it gives access to journals that are specifically focused around biblical studies, around theological matters. It's a great place to narrow down your search on the front end, and you can always make sure from there that it's something that Tyndale has access to, that it's peer reviewed. You'll hear more about that in the future, and then can run with that. Now, once you've done your brainstorming and you've got your research well underway, I often recommend outlining. Now, I know not everybody likes outlines. They think they take a lot of time, but I highly recommend them. Outlining is a great way to get your ideas now organized. So if brainstorming was get the ideas on a page, this is now about organizing those ideas. Now, you'll see here we have a number of different things. So you have your introduction, and we'll talk about, we have your introduction, and we'll talk in a moment about what that looks like. But we have here the body of your paper, where the large majority goes. You have one topic, second topic, third topic. That should probably be more like points, the main points, the big ideas that are going to prove your thesis. Then you have your different points that back up those main points, and then of course the supporting evidences. Now, for those topics, you might actually want to put them as topic sentences. A sentence that introduces what the key idea is you want to get across in that each main point. That big idea that you want to be communicating for the first section of your paper, the second section, the third section, and so on. And then all those supporting evidences, these are things like textual examples, quotes from the book, paraphrases from a journal article, explanations, elaborations, your own thoughts, anything that is going to help communicate your ideas better. And what I love about this kind of outline is you can almost copy and paste once you have it down there. You'll have to fill in some ideas. You may have to make your connections a little bit stronger once you start, but it's a good starting point to get your ideas flowing. But again, this might not be your style. Maybe you're not a list person. Again, maybe you're more visual. I know people who will take cue cards and write down the key ideas on them and then move them around in front of them until they have a structure that works. Maybe you're somebody who needs more columns, looking at how one thing compares to the next. That's also totally fine. Whatever you do, though, just make sure that it logically works for you and take advantage of outlining. It is going to make sure that when you actually get to writing, that you have your ideas clear, coherent, cohesive, that everything is connected and logically flows from one to the next. And you're not going to have to worry about, oh, well, I started writing and then I kind of went over here and then I went back around and now I don't really know what I'm saying anymore. By doing that grunt work on the front end, it will hopefully help you keep your paper in a nice, straight, convincing line. So what structure then makes the most sense? What should your structure look like when you're outlining and also when you start writing? Well, the first thing you want is your introduction. And you'll notice that I call it the paper's roadmap. This is the thing that helps your reader understand the direction your paper will be taking. And I picture it kind of like an upside down triangle. You start general and then you move more specific. And by general, I mean open with a hook. A hook is an attention grabber. It is something that is going to establish what your topic is and why it's important, why your reader should even care about it. This might be an interesting quotation, a short little anecdote, a thought-provoking question, or a startling statistic. Anything that's going to get your reader to sit back and say, that's not bad. Or to put it another way, anything that's going to make your paper stand out from the 37 other papers your professor is going to be reading that day. You want to have in your hook something that just grabs the reader's attention right away so that they are excited and interested for the rest of the paper. After that, I find it's helpful to include context and definitions, those things that you need your reader to understand if they're going to understand the rest of your paper. So if you're writing a paper about free will, you probably should define for me what you mean by free will. If you are going to be doing a case study on retirement and how that affects mental capacity, you're probably going to want to talk a little bit about retirement age and some of the studies that you've understood for the brain and all of that kind of stuff, like neurological decay. You may have to get into some of those topics on the front end so that when you get to the body of your paper, you don't have to spend your time defining, but can now go straight into the important research, the important information that you want to communicate to your readers. Whenever possible, introduce the main topics, those big ideas that are going to support the thesis statement, and then, of course, give the thesis statement. I know I said before it isn't always last. It will often be the last sentence of your introduction in, again, things like English, history, many of your biblical studies courses. But for things like APA papers, things like philosophy, it actually is going to go a lot earlier in the introduction. For philosophy papers, your very first sentence for most philosophy papers will be, in this paper, I will prove or argue or defend blah. That's your thesis right on the front end. get to the point. And that really brings me to this. Different disciplines do things differently. So what I've given you here is a lot more for the humanities, but that's not always going to be the case. APA hates hooks. They don't want you to give you fluff. They just want you to get to the point. So don't give me that startling statistic or short little story. Just go at it. Start communicating what you want to communicate. In other words, this is a good beginning structure, but don't get so settled on it that you aren't willing to change it up depending on the course you're taking. From there, you're going to be going into the body of your paper, and this is where we get into the meat and potatoes. Now, again, this looks different. In APA, those main topics might be things like the method section and the results section and the discussion section. In a humanities paper, it's going to have often unique topics for each of them. Whatever the case, this is kind of what we go into next with the body, the meat and potatoes. And each paragraph of that body should develop an aspect of your thesis. Now, that will look different depending on what kind of paper you're writing, and specifically the length. If you're writing a shorter paper, each paragraph should, yes, be tied directly back to the thesis, whether in the topic or concluding sentences of that paragraph, tied directly back to that thesis statement, that big idea you want to communicate. But in longer papers, like we said before, you don't want to be having 2-page paragraphs. You might have to break those paragraphs down for the different sections. And that means that within the section, you want to refer to the thesis, but within the paragraphs, you want to refer back to the section. So each paragraph should contribute to the main topic that it's currently doing, that main section it's on now, with occasional callbacks to the thesis. And each paragraph should begin with a topic sentence, something that is going to tie back to the previous paragraph, as well as the bigger argument, either the thesis or the section that you're trying to communicate at that time. So you do your introduction where you start general and work specific. You then go through the body where you delve into your research in a lot of detail. And then we get to your conclusion. And notice that this is now a front side up triangle. And I do that because I think conclusions often work like a reverse introduction. They start specific and they move general. So one of the best ways to do that is to rephrase your thesis, but don't repeat it. So please don't copy and paste your thesis statement from the end of your introduction and place it at the beginning of your conclusion. It should be similar. It should express the same idea, but it shouldn't be regurgitated word for word. Now, if space permits, I highly recommend leaving or giving a sentence or two for each, a sentence for sure, for each section, main section of your paper. So if you had 4 main sections, give me 4 sentences, 1 per section, just kind of summarizing your main argument. And what that does is it shows your reader, shows your professor that you know how to condense your argument to its absolute essential ideas, the absolutely most important information that you can communicate it in a clear and concise manner. Conclusions are part summary, but they are also part wrapping up and kind of pointing forward. So leave your reader with something to chew on at the end. A powerful line, an intriguing quotation, a question for further study or application to life. And then those last ones are really important. You want to leave your reader with something to build on. So much of academic writing is about being part of a conversation. So when you do your research, as we talked about earlier, you are joining an academic conversation. You are listening to the voices that people are talking about a topic. You are listening to what people have already been saying, and you're incorporating. You're taking a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit from this and that, and putting it together into the paper so that you can now communicate your idea or argument. When it comes to the conclusion, then, you want to give your readers a possibility to build on your work. You want to leave them with something that they can take to the next step. So allow your readers the opportunity to build on your research by giving them an idea for future study, for how this applies to more than just the discipline you're talking about right now. Give them opportunities to speak into the conversation and use your voice as part of it. And I cannot stress this enough when it comes to conclusions. Please don't introduce something new. You are concluding right now in your conclusion. You are not trying to add new information. All you're going to do is confuse your reader if you do that. So get to the point, wrap up what you've been saying, point them forward, and then end your paper. And remember, your conclusion is the last thing your professor reads before they put a mark on the page. So make sure that you don't start going off on tangents, but actually wrap it up well, clearly communicate your arguments, and then allow them to just sit with the wonderful information that you've communicated. So one last thing I want to talk about quickly for structure. I know we've kind of moved on from the introduction, but I do think it's important we talk about the thesis statement. I have heard it said that the thesis statement is the most important sentence in your paper because it is the sentence that basically summarizes everything that you're trying to communicate. A thesis statement is a statement in which a writer affirms or defends the specific idea that will focus or organize a paper. It's the statement in which a writer affirms or defends the specific idea that will focus or organize a paper. It is the central statement, the unifying one, the idea to which every other point in your paper points. So you want to make sure that you have this thesis clear on the front end. And there's 4 things that make a good thesis statement. First, as we've kind of already said, it should be specific. So don't just tell me that dogs are the best. That's not a good thesis statement. It doesn't tell me anything. It's super vague and doesn't narrow things down enough. You want to communicate specific ideas. Narrow the focus of your thesis so that your reader knows exactly what you want to communicate, what you want to be getting across and proving in your paper. Second, it should be arguable. That means that it needs to be debatable. There needs to be different sides to the thing. You can't just say that wall is green. Well, okay, yes, it is. That's not a debatable point. That's a fact. So your thesis cannot just be stating a fact, and it shouldn't just be your opinion either. A strawberry is the best flavor of ice cream is not a good thesis statement. That's just an opinion, and probably one you disagree with. But you want to have a clear thesis statement that is arguable, that can be debated. I've even heard it said that the best thesis statements can have someone argue the exact opposite, and they'd be able to also write a paper. They could have their own thesis. So make sure that your thesis statement is not just communicating something everybody already knows, but is trying to further the conversation by adding something to it, by presenting an argument to say something's good or bad, that something is strong or weak, whatever the case may be. Third, your paper or your thesis should be interesting. Let's face it, if you're bored, that's going to come through in your writing. But if you're interested, it will be infectious. When you write about a topic that interests you, people get excited. Now, obviously, not every course you take at Tyndale, I know this might be shocking to you, but not every course is going to be your favorite. There are going to be times where you're just not into the subject matter. But even when that's the case, try to find something that entices you. If you are in a history class and you're not a history person, try to write a paper on a person or a time period that does interest you. If you are not really about English, pick the best book that you read throughout the semester and focus on that, because if you are interested, it's going to come across, it's going to be exciting, and your reader's going to want to know more. And finally, make sure your thesis statement is defensible. If you don't have anyone who can back up your claims, it's not a good thesis statement. We're going to talk a little bit later about credibility and why we actually use quotations and paraphrases. But a large part of it is you want someone else to back you up. You need to be able to prove what you've said, not just make a big claim for the sake of making an argument, but it actually needs to be able to be defended. So I like to think of thesis statements kind of like a shish kebab, hence the picture there. If the details of your paper are the meat and the veggies, then the stick, the stick that cuts through everything is your thesis statement. It is the idea that everything else has to tie back to in some way, that thesis pierces through every single idea. So think of that when you're building your paper as an essential information that you want to get across. So let's look at a couple of examples. We won't spend a long time on this. We see in the first thing, a look into the writings of the early church fathers can benefit contemporary Christians by situating them within the Christian tradition. A tradition which stressed healthy but forgotten emphases, including church unity, holistic theology, and the place of tradition alongside scripture. What I love about this thesis is that it is detailed, focused, and specific. We know exactly what this thesis is trying to communicate. It is looking at the writings of the early church fathers. It's looking at how those writings can benefit contemporary Christians. And it's doing so in a particular way by situating it within the Christian tradition. And then there's 3 aspects of that it's looking at: church unity, holistic theology, and the place of tradition alongside scripture.
Now, spoiler alert, that's actually the 3 main points of that paper. We know that in the next paragraph, the first thing we're going to be looking at is church unity. And then the section after that will be holistic theology, and then place of tradition alongside scripture. Clear, communicated, right on the front end. Now I know what the paper is going to look like. So this is what I love about a thesis like this. It gives me not only what's going to be argued, but how it's going to be argued. That how will sometimes be placed immediately before the thesis, immediately after, but it should be there somewhere, even if not in the exact thesis statement itself. The second one, I'm not going to read it out loud, but the thing there is that it's a comparative essay. It allows one text to interpret the other and vice versa. And we know right off the top that we're going to be looking at what? Martin Luther King Jr.'s writings, and we're going to be looking specifically at how the Hindu and the Christian elements. A comparative essay makes it very clear. Now we know exactly what's going to be talked about throughout the course of this essay. So that's kind of essay prep, how we go about preparing to write. From here, you get to just start writing and go away. But before we move on to part 2, where we talk a little more about citation, let's talk about some things that the staff here at Tyndale wish that they had known when they started university. I find this a very useful opening thing, especially for those of you watching because of orientation. Just some things that are useful for you to remember when you're going into classes and as you begin to write. So first things first, know your audience. Learn what your prof wants and then try to stick to that. I think that can be useful advice. There are some professors who do want you to focus more around what they've talked about in class and what they have explained in the readings, but at the same time, don't be afraid to have your own voice or your own opinion. Profs like critical thinking, and there can be a balance here. Some professors will like you to go off of their opinion more than others, but you can do very well on papers if you disagree with them. I've had a paper that I wrote myself where I did not write according to the professor's opinion. In fact, she would have argued the exact opposite of me. She told me herself, but she said that I argued my point well. So keep that in mind. You are not stuck to have only the professor's opinion, but if you are going to disagree with them, you better make sure you back up your points well. Another piece of advice, you shouldn't write like you talk. Profs are looking for more sophisticated language, and that is true. You should not just be writing like you would talk to any Joe Blow on the street. You want to make sure that you are using a bit more sophisticated language, keeping in mind that you are in an academic setting with a very specific style and tone. But at the same time, please don't be pretentious. Your profs will smell it a mile away. They will know you're making things up and you're just trying to sound smart. And in fact, that can actually backfire significantly, because you might think you're sounding smart, but actually when the professor who knows this information better will read it and say you have no idea what you're saying. The goal here is complex ideas, but with simple but clear language. So complex ideas, but with clear language. You want to make sure that your ideas are communicated clearly. And if that means that you don't sound like a thesaurus, that's okay. That's actually probably better. You want to be able to communicate your ideas clearly, but also get those complex ideas across. Coming on from my end, please take your time to edit your papers. Please do not just hand in the first draft as soon as you finish it. I know that can be tempting, but you do not realize how much better you will do on papers when you take that time to go back, to rewrite, to revise, to fix your spelling mistakes. Microsoft Word spell checker is not perfect. It makes mistakes. So make sure that you are going back yourself and fixing it on your own. One thing you're going to want to get good at is learn how to condense info for short papers and extend it for long papers. The reality is, in a 3 or 4 page paper, you don't have time for detail. You have to get across the essential information as quickly and clearly as possible. But in longer papers, you actually want to fill it with extra important information. Don't fill it with fluff. Don't fill it with like additional words or phrases that have nothing to do with anything, but you want to be filling it with information that's going to help. More examples, elaborate on your points. That's what you want to be aiming for longer papers. So learn how to get to the key ideas for short stuff and how to add papers, not with fluff, but with important information for longer papers. It's also good to remember that profs don't just assign readings because they think you're bored, but that there's actually good information in there. You don't know how often I've read through something for class and then realized that was going to be useful for my paper. So Take the time to do the readings. I know as a student that can often feel like one of the lower priorities because there's always more reading to do. But when you're able, get to your readings. They can actually be extremely helpful in the long run. Please don't be scared to ask for help. Your professors here at Tyndale want you to succeed. It's one of the benefits of a small school. Your professors care about you. They want you to do well. And it means they're going to be willing to work with you a little bit more to see that you do well. So take that time to book an appointment with them during their office hours. Speak with them after class. But at the same time, remember that your professors aren't your friends. They are going to push you to think critically, and they will tell you if they think your idea is bad. So make sure that you are ready for that, but work through it, get through it, and they're going to push you to be a better thinker. That's the goal by the end of this. So they're going to help you understand that and become better as a result. Please learn from a low grade. I know a bad grade on an assignment for some students can be like the worst thing in the world, but it's going to happen. You are, especially in this first year, you're probably there's gonna be a bit of a learning curve. You're gonna have to work through some of that stuff. Don't treat it as a horrible disaster. Learn from it, and then you improve on that. Honestly, when your professors give you comments on your papers, read them, go over them, make sure you know what's going on. It can be super helpful for you in the long run. And finally, different papers look for different things. I know I've kind of already communicated this a few times, but how you write an English paper is different than how you write a biblical studies paper. How you write a philosophy paper is different than how you write a psychology paper. They are looking for different ideas, different methods of communication. They are looking for just different styles, even in some cases. So recognize that, know that you're going to have to kind of change up your style in order to do well on these papers. In short, one of the best pieces of advice I can give you as you start out in these early days of universities is learn to adapt. Things are going to be, especially in these first year or two where you are taking lots of different courses, it's going to look different. It's going to take time. It's going to be frustrating at times. But if you can learn how to adapt and how to build from one idea to the next, how to take what worked in one class and apply it to another, but not getting so set in your ways, that's going to help you a ton. So learn to adapt in different classes, for different assignments, for different disciplines, and be ready to ask questions. Ask your classmates, people in years higher than you, ask your professors. They're willing to help you, but take that time, be prepared to adapt, and if you do, you're going to do well here.
And we're going to pause right there for a moment. I know that was a lot of information, so feel free to get up and stretch or get a glass of water or something like that. We have one more big thing we want to talk about, which is citation. There's a lot of misconceptions about how to cite and what you need to cite, so I want to make sure that you have some time learning what is proper. So take a break, come back with a fresh set of eyes, and then we will start part 2. See you in a minute.